Hello, welcome everyone to our sixth Strengthening Democracy, a research exchange practice series for this year. Today's titled Transforming Public Input into Policy Impact. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and the Wurundjeri people as the lands from which I'm coming, and the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the ACT, where UC's Bruce campus is situated. I deeply believe that any discussion about democracy can't begin without acknowledging that sovereignty of this country was never ceded and the right of all First Nations people to self-determination. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to any other First Nations people here with us today. So hello everyone and welcome. For those of you who don't know or haven't been to one of these, the Strengthening Democracy Research Practice Exchange was designed as a conversation between leading researchers and practitioners working to strengthen democracy in Australia and beyond. I noticed in the registrations we have some international guests here today too. So we hope that by bringing together these different insights and exploring these innovative ideas or strategies or solutions with these two lenses, that we can find new ways to address the challenges facing democracies today. And before I introduce today's topic, I also would like to acknowledge that today we are recording the session. So it's going to be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So please be aware of this if you're asking any questions during question and answer time. So today we're exploring an issue that sits right at the heart of democratic practice and public trust, how the voices of communities can move beyond consultation and dialogue to actually shape the policies and decisions that affect their lives. Governments and public institutions are increasingly turning to these deliberative and participatory processes because they offer something we all recognise is needed, that richer dialogue, more diverse perspectives, and the decisions that actually reflect the reality of the communities they serve. But as many of us know, the real challenge comes after the conversation ends. How do we make sure that this public input is meaningfully informs policy outcomes? How do we honour the promise of genuine participation while also navigating the constraints and complexities of the public service? So to explore this topic, I feel really fortunate to get to explore it with two incredible people. We have Auntie Tracy Evans here, a proud Gunditjmara Mara and Bundjalung woman. She's an elected member of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, as well as a deeply respected public servant with decades of experience. She brings wisdom, cultural authority, lived experience of leading change from both inside and outside institutions. And her perspective on what it takes to honour community voices in policymaking is both powerful and essential. And we have Professor Carolyn Hendricks, who is one of the leading scholars of democratic innovation and public policy. Her work has shaped how we think about participation, not only how governments engage with communities, but also how citizens themselves organise and take action to shape democratic life. So she brings both the depths of research and a keen understanding of the practice. So I think it is a rare and truly special to have both of these perspectives: First Nations leadership, practitioner and institutional experience, and academic insight brought together in one conversation. So again, I am grateful to Auntie Tracy and Caroline for joining us and sharing their knowledge. So I'm going to jump straight into the first question. I'm going to stop sharing. And so the first question is for Auntie Tracy. From your perspective, as both a community leader and a senior public servant, what does it take for government to genuinely hear and act on First Nations voices rather than just consult?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll first acknowledge country. So I'll acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri here in Victoria. I've lived all my life here in Melbourne. And so being respectful to the traditional owners is really, really important. And I acknowledge all elders, past, present and emergent, And I honour my ancestors, my elders, and my old people. That they give me the strength to do the work that I need to do as a leader of my people, and the elected role that I have on the First People's Assembly, representing Melbourne Metropolitan, and being democratically elected in that position as well. So it's my people who have voted me in, and there's no greater honour than that. So it takes time, right? Um, and the reality is, us as Aboriginal people are still here, ain't going nowhere. We have the historical wrongdoings of our nation as well that's behind us. We have our trailblazers as our community, our elders and our ancestors that have fought the good fight for us and give us what we have today. So, it really does take time. And when I think about where I began my journey as an advocate, it probably was in the areas of employment, where I was the only Aboriginal person. For instance, I worked with the Department of Defence, Air Force, predominantly. The space was held by men, so you can certainly see as an Aboriginal woman what they looked like, and I probably knew from a very early age that things looked different to me, and what I stood for in terms of the cultural knowledge and understanding, and the cultural upbringing that I'd been given. So it is definitely time. I think that's pretty important. I think the principles really haven't altered. And when I talk about principles, I talk about the cultural principles on which we have held and what I've held all my life. It's just that the desire for us to have equality and justice for our people has grown stronger. And it's certainly, in my case, I just remember being very defiant from a young age in my schooling, and then in my educational and into the employment. So, we see self-determinations now being written into documents and the legislation and policy. And legislation is really important because you can't unpick what's in legislation. So language is really, really important as well. So when you write policy and you write may do this, may do that, it doesn't give rise to what you must do. Whereas the legislation is pretty important. It once something's in legislation, it's really hard to unpick. So the Treaty Act, and that was legislation that gave rise to the formation of the Assembly. So that's 32 traditional owners. And when you have 32 traditional owners with such diversity and custodians and carers of country across Victoria, that means that the government has to deal with us now, that they have to know that traditional ownership, that there's a place for traditional ownership. We've taken up our space as traditional owners, and under the Treaty Act, as the Aboriginal representative body, we're able to negotiate state-wide treaties. So I'd also like to add that the champions in government who advocate on behalf of us at various levels, whether it be junior levels or higher than the position that I hold, that we also count on our champions and our allies and the importance of allyship in this space. So, they are some of the things that it takes for government to genuinely hear and act on the voices of my people, and that it's not a ticker box anymore, and it can't be, and that consultation, it isn't just about consulting. There are other layers of what community engagement, community development principles look like. So that's just some of my sharing in relation to that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Auntie Tracy. It's a great start to our conversation. And Carolyn, what practical steps can help policymakers reconcile the lived experiences of communities with the technical or bureaucratic language, which we just heard Arnie Tracy talk about a little bit as well, the bureaucratic language and the approach of government?
Thank you, and thank you, Arnie Tracy, for that, taking us into some of the principles that you've offered. I'm here in the room, so I'm going to try and talk to people in the room, but also to the camera if I'm looking a bit strange. I guess I wanted just also to start by saying that I'm a Ngunnawal land, and I wanted to pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I guess the question, Emanuela, about how do we reconcile these lived experiences of community with the language or the technical kind of approach often taken by government, I wanted to start by sort of acknowledging that there has been a lot of gains made, a progress, if you like, between sort of in our public governance system to recognise that there are some lived experiences in our community that are of value to public governance. That wasn't probably the case couple of decades ago. And so I think in some respects, there has been some progress, particularly in terms of seeing communities as sources of expertise, particularly local expertise, and also in their own lived experiences. So you hear a lot of this expression of lived experience experts, it's often used by MPs. And I guess this is coming from a space of sort of managerial and epistemic rationales as opposed to democratic pressure. So in public policy, certainly in Australia, you see a lot of synergies with this idea of lived experience, communities' lived experience with new public management discourse, because if we better understand communities' lived experience, particularly of service users, we can improve the efficiencies of public services. We also hear a lot of lived experience rhetoric around the idea of social licence, that if we understand communities' experiences, we can better predict the barriers and opportunities to policy implementation. So I guess in answering your question, Emmanuel, I kind of wanted to ask, how can we go beyond these instrumental uses of, community experiences and building towards sort of mutual understanding that I think Auntie Tracy was sort of referring to in the work that she's doing, mutual understanding between communities and those that govern them. And I guess I've got 4 kind of practical tips, but I'm sure there's more wealth in the room, both online and here. But the first thing I would say, and I think Auntie Tracy talked to this a bit, is that both communities and government are diverse. So we often homogenise both of those things. And particularly in communities, there's a lot of homogenising of the government, but yet we know that even within public agencies, there can be one arm that is very receptive to public input, but another arm of that same agency that really finds more technocratic approaches more appealing to their KPIs and other measures. So, and the same can be said of how governments view communities. They can homogenise. Arnie Tracy talked about sort of the men often in the room. So getting a better, deeper appreciation of that diversity in community is important. I think we need to adopt a wider view of community experiences. So before I talked about how community experiences is often reduced down to a sort of service user perspective or a lived experience of someone with disability. And they're useful for public policy design and delivery, but I think we often overshadow other kinds of community experiences that can be deeply valuable to public governance. So some of these include, for example, the temporal and spatial dimensions that communities hold on either a place or on a problem. And governments, because they come and go, and indeed public servants come and go rapidly, they don't tend to hold that kind of spatial and temporal knowledge that communities often hold, particularly communities of place. So there's deep experiences in communities around history and around failed public policy initiatives, and also around dysfunction, I think, policy dysfunction. So we saw a lot of this in Australia in the Black Summer fires when communities were trying to wrestle with the onslaught, continuous and cascading onslaught of different disasters, fires, floods, COVID, And communities were the ones that were experiencing multiple governance interventions from civil society groups, governments, and churches and different groups. And it was only communities that could hold together this onslaught. They were the ones that were seeing lots of different interventions. And the siloed nature in which community consultation often happens, even well-meaning, cannot often be comprehended through an agency or through an organisational lens. The third, I guess, practical tip, is kind of about joint ways of working. And I think that's about early intervention. Often we know, and we've always known this in the community consultation field, that, the later you come into a problem, the harder it is to kind of involve community. But I think that still holds. I think there's still a lot of ad hoc and kind of community engagement that happens too late. The other thing is that many people working in government are themselves community members. And so what I've observed in some of the work that I've been looking at in Northeast Victoria is how some effective governance, community and government interventions, they allow participants to wear multiple hats. They're not asking people in the room to just dissociate yourself from being a community member for the moment and just be the representative from the water agency or from the environment agency, but actually you're from that locality and you happen to be, a participant in the school community, and you happen to also be working for the local government or the federal government. So that actually has enabled some really important trust building across people in place, because they don't see government as someone out there. Government is someone in the room, in their community. And that only works when you've got public servants that are embedded in place. So certainly in the Victorian government, when they're doing regional planning, they have a lot of public servants all around the state. They're not Melbourne-based. The final point, and I think Marnie Tracy sort of pointed to this a bit, was about investment in pilot projects and demonstrating tangible outcomes. I think the only way communities can start to build that trust with government is through seeing that their investment of time, another talk fest, or is it actually going to generate something? And I think it's the same for the skeptics within public agencies, that they can see possibilities through tangible projects. So I think there's a lot of value in demonstrating what can be produced, the small wins, so that people then are willing to further invest. I'll hand it back, Emanuela.
Thank you. I think that point about people wearing different hats and not necessarily having to ask people to just be sort of just to bring one part of themselves is such an important thing. I bet that really resonates for many of the members of the First Peoples Assembly too, Auntie Tracy.
Yeah.
My next question for you, Auntie Tracy, was all through the First Peoples Assembly, we're really seeing new ways to bring community voice and self-determination into government. So what lessons do you think we can take from the way the First Peoples Assembly has actually approached their work?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time on the Assembly. So I've been elected twice. It's my second term. We've spent a lot of time talking about cultural authority, cultural obligation, and self-determination, and enacting what that actually looks like on the ground. And as opposed to myself being a public servant, it's important in my role, and this is the walking in two worlds, wearing multiple hats, is for government to understand what self-determination is about. It's not just a word, the understanding of why it's important to my people. And so, here in Victoria, we have the Victorian Aboriginal Affairs Framework, which outlines the principles of Aboriginal self-determination as a guiding document. And so we talk about the notion of strength in numbers and the collective voice. So the collective voice is really important because it is the voice of all of us together that brings the strength. And that is about a generational shift in what we see as important now, to us as Aboriginal people here in Victoria, and what we see as being important to uphold for future generations. So it's about also the tangible things. So it's no longer just think about self-determination as something that's a bit of a buzzword to put in a policy document. It's about what are the tangible things, what are the actions that can demonstrate from that, and what can be demonstrated for to show your commitment to self-determination and what it is that you say to the people that you want to work with. So that's really important. So if I think about Aboriginal decision making as one of the principles of self-determination, if you're organising a project where it involves a steering committee, well, then to enact something, to show an action, would be to have a place on that steering committee for an Aboriginal person. So governance is really important, and you ensure that you have people that are in spaces where they're able to be listened and heard. So that's just some of the principles that. So I'd say think about self-determination, think about what it looks like from a grassroots perspective. And, I'm pretty good in that. I've worked with policy and programs for a very long time, that I'm able to look at things and identify, the things that are missing from particular policy and programs. And we want to rewrite the history for our people, and we want to be sure that we put ourselves in the driver's seat to let government and anyone who wants to do business with us in how we want to do the business going forward. And we don't want to do it from a deficit model. We want to do it from the strength that we come from. And that's sort of the basis of where we're, where we've been working from on the Assembly for the last 5 years. Thank you.
I really like that framing of not working from a deficit model, and I think that speaks to what Carolyn was saying as well. Carolyn, last question for you specifically, because then I've got a couple of questions for you both. You've written about the democratic value of community-led action. How can governments support these efforts without co-opting or diluting them?
Yeah, big question. So just to clarify, the book that I've just written with Albert de Zoer, who wanted to be here, but he couldn't make it, unfortunately. But this is about a particular kind of democratic action. So it's not about protesting or, I guess, advocating per se, but the book tries to shine a light on a particular realm of civil society that's not really well understood from a democratic point of view. And so we draw on about 30 case studies where we look specifically at these, we call them community-led or citizen-led governance spaces. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially they're spaces where citizens get together to solve problems, collective problems. So they're not asking someone else to fix the market or fix the policy dysfunction. They're actually just giving it a go themselves. And often they're motivated because they're frustrated at the lack of action, or, for example, in the climate space, that the action that's being taken is not on the right path. So we look at these spaces, and I guess they hold that notion that only Tracy's talking about, that they're in the driver's seat. So these are citizen initiatives that may or may not be compliant with law or government policy. But there's a very practical element to these spaces. They're often doing quite innovative and experimental or even disruptive work, but they are engaging inclusively. So we focus the book on those that are doing fairly, democratically enhancing work, not sort of exclusive and destructive work. And we can talk a bit more about that. But I guess, so when we think about what does it take for government actors and also professionalised civil society groups to support these, we come up with about 3 main sort of headlines. And I guess the first one is about recognition. So recognising that communities are leading problem solving. So a practical example of that was in 2021, in the middle of COVID, or actually at the beginning of COVID, so in 2020, the Victorian government launched an inquiry, the Victorian Parliament, on climate change, but it was specifically looking at what are communities doing to lead action on climate change. So there was a recognition by the Victorian Parliament that actually communities are often ahead of government in some spaces, and if they're not ahead, they're doing work that the government needs to at least understand and possibly come in behind them or make them more inclusive or work with them. So recognition is the first kind of, I guess, point. Yeah, so that it's not just about government fixing problems, that the communities themselves have a lot of problem-solving ideas and indeed a lot of practical efforts already underway. The second point was really about support rather than control. So what you see in a lot of these spaces is governments well-meaningly sort of saying, oh, look, the communities themselves got that trust, they've developed a practical solution, let's come in and go in underneath it. So the most classic case of that for the Australian people in the audience is the Landcare initiative, which was a community-led initiative in the 1980s, and successive local and state and federal governments sort of come in to try and boost that, but ultimately there have been waves of the Landcare through its history where governments have basically just taken control. And so it's left some of those more empowered communities feeling like they don't have agency in the space. So I think allowing policy support, either through resources and financing, but not stifling the innovation and the energy that the community is bringing. And the third one is really kind of loops back to what I think Tracy was saying, is really about sort of respecting citizen agency and autonomy, that there are going to be times when these community-led initiatives want to work with other partners, but there are also going to be times when they want to step back and do the work themselves. And that's a kind of, so the state, if you like, has to step back and be a funder or a facilitator or even a coordinator rather than sort of a driver. And that's not always an easy role for particularly government agencies to accept. But they seem to be the kind of main features when we see effective collaboration between community-led initiatives and state support.
Yeah. I can see how that kind of circles back to that, really taking time to focus on what self-determination can mean for communities as well, doesn't it? So I've got a question for you both. You both work across the worlds of community and government. Taking Carolyn's point that they're not monolithic, they're not homogeneous, but you both work across these two worlds. What are the biggest barriers you see to translating community voices into policy? We might start with you, Annie Tracy.
Sure. Can you hear me? Because the volume's gone down a bit.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Sure. So I think the systems itself, so, that's a barrier. There's no doubt about that. I think about legislation, age-old legislation that is in place that hasn't kept up with the times and the changing nature of communities and the aspirations of community. Sometimes we have legislation that is not reflective of where communities see themselves. They continue to oppress. So I call them the systems of oppression. They certainly are. And I think it's about being authentic. So, sometimes authenticity and engaging with communities is an area that can be seen as a barrier if it's not done in a respectful manner. I think so making promises that you can't keep. And so sometimes you might go into engaging with the community and it might be all bells and whistles and everything looks fantastic, but under the reality of it, the management of risks becomes more of a focus in the end goal of upholding self-determination and making action that will allow true, authentic work that allows for the aspirations for the community to come to life. Not taking the time to build rapport, quite often there's limited flexibility in how you work with community. You got X amount of dollars, you've got to get outcomes out the door, you know, so somehow that takes greater precedence over the simpleness and the importance of building rapport with the community and taking that time to do it. So doing your homework, researching before you engage, understanding, you know, for instance, if you're doing a project in the youth space, understand what is the demographics of Aboriginal youth, you know, what does regional versus metro, you know, so planning your engagement. So when you don't plan your engagement and it's timely and rushed, they can be some of your biggest barriers to actually getting the outcomes that is what you signed up in the first place to actually do and said you would do for the very people. And, you know, there's some of the things that I like to always make note of when I'm engaging as a government employee with community, to, you know, lend my voice behind flexibility, ensuring a flexible approach. If you focus too much on the risks, well, then the reality is you're probably not going to, you know, you're not going to uphold what it is you said you would do when you received funding for a particular project. And, you know, so flexibility is really important. If you don't have flexibility, and if you think about, you know, compliance too much and risk management, well, then I would suggest that you're actually investing in areas of that really don't allow for the progressiveness of what it is that you're wanting from engaging with the Aboriginal community or any other community for that matter. Because, you know, if you just focus on risks, if that's all that you're thinking about, well, you're never going to get anywhere, and you're not going to get the outcomes that the community is telling you that you want. It's as simple as that. So those are some of the things that I see as being barriers, and they get in the way of you know, turning the community voices into the policy that you're working with. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Annie Tracy. And Carolyn, did you?
Yeah, lots of overlap, so I won't go too much down the same points. But I mean, I sort of had it. I was thinking around fear, which is the other side of the risk management stuff. So sort of, I think there's a great awareness of the value of community, as we talked about before, and also the knowledge of how to engage. Like there's endless you know, models and guidebooks on how we need to have good engagement, but I think there's considerable fear and inflexibility within the public service at certain levels. I think at middle, senior, but not necessarily at the executive level, about what engagement will do to the program or the project or the KPIs. So the fear of the mess, I think working with communities can be messy. Fear of losing control about what it might produce, fear of getting it wrong. I think when you get over those fears, or they feel like they can manage those risks, I think what I see is, and this relates also to what Annie Tracy was saying, was a kind of project-focused way of understanding community input. So it's a project or a process to be managed or outsourced with expertise and slotted in. It's not a relational process. It's not about that trust building, rapport building that Annie Tracy talked about. So it's about timelines and budgets and a sort of you know, there's a technocracy that is attached to the participation. I mean, it's sort of the irony of of what happens in public engagement practice, that it can be quite a technocratic space as opposed to a relational building space. And the third thing I think that I observe is that consultation is seen as an add-on, something that helps governments do what they're doing. So sort of like an add-on to official knowledge. So it enhances what governments were trying and are trying to do as a bonus kind of thing. Whereas when we think about public engagement in that way, there's little space for redefining the actual problem that is at the heart of what the government's trying to do. There's less recognition of that community problem solving I was talking about before. And also there's little power then for the community to help with the implementation of whatever we need to do to fix the problem, so to speak. So I feel like seeing public engagement as just an add-on to something that's going to help within a defined scope really creates, it's a kind of another way of talking about what Auntie Tracy said, the system. Yeah.
You know, that made me think of the Uruk Commission, Auntie Tracy, and truth-telling, and how you need to begin from that place of truth-telling, which is uncomfortable, but then moving on from there. You might want to add a little bit about that.
Yeah. So so definitely truth telling, and I think because of the Uruk Commission, it was actually stood up from the Assembly. So the Assembly, a member on the Assembly, it was his idea, and then it grew the legs to make happen. So that's the power of a collective voice, right? One voice and then many voices creating this commission. And you know, and yeah, it was uncomfortable for the state to give testimony at the Uruk Commission, but it's a resetting of the relationship. And, you know, Treaty in Victoria resets the relationship and says, well, these are the things that are important to us. And, you know, these are the things that form part of the negotiations with the state. So, yeah, so definitely truth telling, and I love my fair share of truth telling. I think, you know, the longer you've been a public servant and the more you understand the beast of government, the more you can strategically and tactfully tell your truths. And, you know, you know, first and foremost, I'm a proud Aboriginal woman. Make that very clear in what I bring to the table. And I also understand government well. And, you know, the balance of both of those, you know, expertise is what probably allows me to do the work that I can do without giving away my cultural rights. You know, because my cultural rights are important as a traditional owner, and you know, the cultural obligations that I have to my community, that, you know, I hold those very dear now as a leader of my people. And you know, I choose to stand up and speak up when I need to, and then I sit down and provide the level of strategic engagement and advocacy, you know, from that lens, where I don't have to be loud and boisterous, because I can, you know, I can be who I truly am. And, you know, that's the reality and the value of, you know, the work that I've been doing on the Assembly and the work that I do day to day as in government.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm gonna ask my last question, although I do recognise that I want to leave some time for people to
Yes.
audience to ask questions. But I did have one last quick question for both of you, because I wanted to end my questions on a positive note. Are there any recent shifts, either in institutions, political culture, public service practice, that give you hope about the future of more participatory policy making? Do you want to start, Caroline, this time?
Sure. I'll just briefly, I mean, I guess we've been talking a lot about communities and state relationships, but we know most complex public policy issues involve a mix of state, civil society and market actors, right? And so what I've been observing in some areas where there's all that sort of interplay, a governance interplay, is some savvy work on the part of community to develop some strategic plans about how they want to negotiate that space going forward. So what I'm talking about here are practical projects around, say, regional planning or around renewable energy transitions, where communities are saying, look, we can see this, the next 10 to 15, 20 years, we've got to either dive into this space and create the conditions of engagement ourselves, or this is going to be imposed upon us and we won't have much agency. And so in the northeast Victoria, I've been following community who've been doing this around water. So, the federal government's coming in with a massive water plan, and they've developed a, 15-year plan themselves. It's not being led by local government. They're looking over jurisdictional boundaries. So it's coming from a place that this is our community, this is our region, and this is our vision, and these are how we want to engage with actors, come in and support this vision we have. And the same sort of thing is happening. There's a great example in the Shire of Hay, which is in New South Wales, where the community has set a kind of conditions of engagement that they want around renewable energy sort of development. And that's kind of counter story to the main narrative we hear around rural and regional communities, opposing these developments because they feel like it's happening to them. So there are a couple of examples, I think, where communities are thinking strategically about if we don't shape this, it'll descend on us not on our terms.
Fantastic examples. Love those. Auntie Tracy, do you have some?
Yeah. So we down here and through some of the work that I've been doing in government is the telling your story notion. So, for instance, if there's grants and you've got Aboriginal organisations or traditional owners, a program where you're wanting them to apply for a grant, that it's set up and the expression of interest is set up on the telling your story, as simple as that. Tell us your story. Tell us what your issue is. What is your solution? So, bringing it down to the grassroots level, I think, greater engagement with traditional owners here and understanding the fundamental difference that exists between the ACOs and traditional owners. So ACOs are the Aboriginal community controlled organisations, and traditional owner are, traditional owners of country. That's not saying that traditional owners of country, their only focus is caring for country, because all the areas of, for instance, the delivery that ACOs bring, the recognition that if traditional owners choose to work in the area of employment or child protection or justice outcomes, then that they have an actual right as well to deliver in that space as well. We talk about co-design, Aboriginal-led, equal partners. Our community is very clear on the position of, you want to partner with us, then we are an equal partner. We don't sit as someone who, unfortunately, we are dependent on government for funding, but we sit as an equal partner in how we do business together. And so, Aboriginal-led processes and making that very clear to who we do business with in how it's led by us as Aboriginal people, and straight up front making that pretty clear on what those principles look like is pretty important with the movement that is occurring down here in Victoria, and it gives greater voice to Aboriginal people here in Victoria.